I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen watching my daughter-in-law pop a bottle of expensive champagne. She was laughing loudly, clinking glasses with her brother, boasting about how they had finally pushed the clueless old lady out of her own home. I did not yell, and I did not shed a single tear. I simply smiled, handed her my heavy brass keys, and walked right out my front door with my head held high. She really thought she had won the lottery that afternoon. She had no idea those keys were about to unlock the biggest financial nightmare of her life. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started. My name is Shirley. I am 68 years old, and I'm a proud retired pediatric nurse. For 4 decades, I worked grueling double shifts at a busy Atlanta hospital. I spent countless nights on my feet comforting sick children while my own body ached just so I could build a solid foundation for my only son, Andre. I raised that boy single-handedly. I paid for his college tuition straight out of my own pocket so he could graduate without a penny of debt. I bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, a true symbol of my hard work. I polished the oak floors by hand and planted rose bushes in the front yard. That house was my American dream realized. My peace started slipping away the day Andre married Brittany. She was a woman who presented herself as sweet and accommodating, but I saw right through her. She cared more about designer labels and status than she cared about my son. A few years into their marriage, Andre came to me looking exhausted. He said they were struggling to save for a down payment on a house of their own, out of the pure love a mother has for her child. I opened my doors. I told them they could move in with me for just 1 year to get on their feet. I even gave them my spacious master suite and moved myself into the small guest room downstairs. I thought I was giving my son a stepping stone. Instead, I invited a parasite into my sanctuary. It did not take long for Brittany to drop her sweet act. She started treating my house like it was her personal property. She would invite her entitled brother Brad over constantly. He practically lived on my sofa, eating my groceries and leaving a mess in every room. When I would cook my traditional Southern meals, the very food that nourished my son his whole life, Brittany and Brad would loudly complain. They would pinch their noses and say the heavy ethnic smells were ruining the modern vibe of the house. I swallowed my pride and kept quiet to keep the peace for Andre, but his silence was breaking my heart. To understand how we got to that moment in my kitchen, you have to understand the foundation that house was built on. My name is Shirley. For 40 years I worked as a pediatric nurse at one of the busiest hospitals in Atlanta. I spent 4 decades working grueling 12-hour shifts, often picking up double shifts just to make ends meet. I can still remember the feeling of walking through my front door at 3 a.m, my back aching and my ankles so swollen they spilled over the edges of my white nursing shoes. I spent countless nights on my feet, comforting sick children, holding the hands of terrified parents, and pushing through my own exhaustion. I skipped my own meals in the hospital cafeteria more times than I can count, saving those few extra dollars every single day. I did it all because I had a vision. I was a single black mother, and I was determined to carve out a piece of the American dream for my boy, Andre. That 4-bedroom house in the suburbs was not just a building to me. It was the physical manifestation of my blood, my sweat, and my tears. When I finally saved enough for the down payment, I walked into that empty house and cried. Over the years, I poured my soul into every inch of it. I got down on my hands and knees to polish those solid oak floors until they shined like glass. I spent my weekends out in the Georgia heat, digging into the soil to plant the rose bushes that line the front yard. Every spring, those roses bloomed a vibrant deep red, standing as a proud symbol of what a woman can grow when she refuses to give up. That house was my fortress, my sanctuary and my legacy, and everything I built for Andre. He was my golden child, my only son, the absolute center of my universe. His father was not in the picture, so it was just the two of us against the world. I made a promise to myself early on that Andre would never feel the absence of what we could not afford. I worked those extra shifts so he could have new sneakers for the basketball team, and so he could go on school trips with his friends. When it came time for him to go to college, I looked at the cost and I did not flinch. I refused to let my son start his adult life suffocating under the weight of student loans. I paid his college tuition entirely out of pocket, every semester, I sat at my kitchen table, wrote out those heavy checks, and balanced my checkbook down to the very last penny. Seeing my son walk across that graduation stage holding his degree, knowing he was stepping into his future completely debt-free, was the proudest moment of my life. I gave him the world because that is what a mother does. We empty ourselves out so our children can be full. Keeping that house and putting a young black man through college as a single mother was no small feat. There were months when I did not know how I was going to pay the light bill, but I always found a way. I took on side jobs helping elderly neighbors with their medical care on my days off. I wore the same winter coat for 15 years, so Andre could have the textbooks he needed. I never complained. I never asked for pity. Every time I looked around my beautiful home, from the crown molding in the living room to the large bay windows that let the morning sun pour in, I knew every sacrifice was worth it. Andre grew up to be a handsome, successful, and articulate man. He landed a fantastic job right out of college. I thought my job was done. I thought I could finally kick off my shoes, sit on my back patio with a glass of sweet tea, and enjoy the golden years I had worked so incredibly hard to earn. My peace began to slip away the day Andre brought Brittany into my life. When Andre first told me he was getting married, I was overjoyed. I wanted nothing more than to see him settle down and build a family. Brittany was a white American woman who presented herself as sweet, charming, and endlessly accommodating. On the surface, she said all the right things. But as a woman who has lived long enough to read between the lines, I saw the cracks in her facade very early on. Brittany had a superficial edge to her. She was deeply materialistic, constantly obsessing over designer labels, the kind of car people drove, and the price tags attached to everything around her. When she came to my house for Sunday dinners, she would make little comments under her breath about how my traditional decor was outdated, or she would subtly brag about the expensive vacations her friends were taking. She cared more about status than she cared about the substance of a person. But I kept my mouth shut. I bit my tongue and smiled because Andre looked at her like she hung the moon. If my son was happy, I was determined to be supportive. A few years into their marriage, the reality of their lifestyle began to catch up with them. One rainy Tuesday evening, Andre came over to my house looking completely exhausted. The bright, confident young man I had raised looked defeated. He sat at my kitchen table, resting his head in his hands, and confessed that they were drowning. They were trying to save for a down payment on a house of their own, but the cost of living was just too high. Between their expensive apartment rent, their car notes, and the lifestyle Brittany insisted on maintaining, they were barely keeping their heads above water. My heart went out to my son. Even though he was a grown man to me, he was still the little boy who used to do his homework at that very same table, out of the pure, unconditional love a mother has for her child. I made an offer that would ultimately break my heart. I told Andre that he and Brittany could move into my spacious home. I told them it would just be temporary, maybe for a year, just long enough for them to eliminate their expensive rent and save up a solid down payment for a place of their own. I thought I was throwing my son a lifeline. I wanted to give them a stepping stone so they could build a beautiful future. I went above and beyond to make them feel comfortable. My home has a gorgeous, massive master suite on the second floor. It has a walk-in closet and a beautiful ensuite bathroom with a soaking tub. I had earned that room. I had paid for that room with my own aching joints and sleepless nights. But I packed up my clothes, boxed up my personal belongings, and moved myself down into the much smaller guest bedroom on the first floor. I gave them the master suite because I wanted them to have their privacy and space as a married couple. I spent an entire weekend scrubbing the baseboards and clearing out space in the garage for their boxes. I remember the day they moved their things into my house. Brittany walked through my front door, acting incredibly gracious, thanking me profusely and calling me an angel. But her eyes were darting around my living room, measuring the space, calculating the square footage. She did not look like a grateful guest. She looked like a woman inspecting property she fully intended to own. I pushed that thought out of my mind, telling myself I was just being a protective mother, holding on to unnecessary anxiety. I cooked a big welcome dinner that night, roasted chicken collard greens and macaroni and cheese. I watched them settle into the master suite, hearing their footsteps above me as I lay in the small downstairs bed. I convinced myself that the sacrifice was a small price to pay for my son's financial freedom. I was a mother doing what mothers do best, giving everything she has, shrinking her own footprint, just to give her child a better chance at the world. I just did not realize that some people see a mother's sacrifice not as an act of love, but as a weakness to be exploited. I truly believed I was building a bridge for my son. I was completely unaware that I was inviting a parasite into my sanctuary. A parasite that was already planning to consume everything I had spent my entire life building. It did not take long for Brittany to drop her sweet facade completely. Once the boxes were unpacked and she felt secure in the master bedroom, the subtle disrespect turned into blatant disregard for the life I had built. I came home one afternoon from running errands to find a heavy metal dumpster parked in my driveway. Panic seized my chest. I rushed through my front door, only to find the living room completely stripped of its soul. The heavy oak coffee table my grandmother gave me, the antique floral armchairs I had bought with my very first nursing paycheck, and the framed vintage quilts that decorated my walls were all gone. In their place were cold, sharp-edged, minimalist pieces of grey furniture that looked like they belonged in a sterile hospital waiting room. When I asked Brittany what was going on, she did not even have the decency to look apologetic. She just flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and let out a heavy sigh. She told me my things were outdated and cluttered. She said she needed a modern aesthetic for her mental well-being, and my old heirlooms simply did not fit the vision she had for the space. She had literally thrown my family history into a rented dumpster without ever asking for my permission. I stood there staring at the empty space where my life used to be, feeling like a ghost haunting the house I had paid for with my own sweat. But the disrespect did not stop with the furniture. It walked right through my front door in the form of Brittany brother Brad. Brad was an entitled, arrogant man who seemed to think the world owed him a living. He practically moved into my house. He never knocked and he never asked to come over. He would just barge in, plop his dirty boots on the new grey sofa, and start demanding things. He raided my pantry every single day, eating the expensive groceries I bought with my fixed retirement income, leaving greasy wrappers and empty soda cans scattered across my clean kitchen counters. He treated me like I was the hired help rather than the homeowner. He would literally snap his fingers at me from the living room and ask if I had made any fresh coffee, or he would complain that the bathroom towels were not soft enough for his liking. I was a 68-year-old woman being ordered around in my own home by a man who did not pay a single dime toward the light bill. The breaking point for me, the moment that truly shattered my heart, happened on a Sunday afternoon. Sundays were my sacred days for cooking. I spent all morning in the kitchen preparing a massive traditional southern feast. I made smothered pork chops, candied yams, baked macaroni and cheese, and a big cast-iron pan of hot buttermilk cornbread. I put my heart into that food, pouring generations of family love into every single pot. I thought that maybe, just maybe, sitting down to a good hearty meal together would bridge the gap that was growing between us. Instead, Brittany and Brad walked into the kitchen, pinching their noses. Brad coughed loudly and fanned the air with his hands in an exaggerated, mocking motion. He looked at the beautiful feast I had spent hours preparing and sneered. He complained about the heavy ethnic smell ruining the house. Brittany immediately chimed in, agreeing with him, saying that the greasy odor was going to seep into the new expensive curtains she had just bought. She told me I needed to start cooking lighter, more mainstream food if I insisted on using the kitchen while they were living there. The sheer audacity of their words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The food of my ancestors. The warm meals that had nourished my son his entire life were suddenly a stinking nuisance to the people sleeping under my roof. I turned to look at Andre. I looked at my beautiful, successful, intelligent son, desperately waiting for him to defend me. I waited for him to stand up, put his arm around his mother, and tell his wife and her brother to show some respect in this house. But Andre just stared at the floor. He shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot, refusing to meet my eyes. He finally mumbled that maybe we could open a few windows to air the place out. He told me he just wanted to keep the peace. He asked me to be a little more accommodating because Brittany was feeling stressed about their finances, and her brother was just trying to support her. Keep the peace. That was his pathetic excuse for letting his wife and her brother trample all over his mother's dignity. I did not say a word. I turned off the stove, carefully covered the food I had cooked with so much love, and walked down the hall to my tiny downstairs bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed and swallowed my tears, feeling a heavy, dark sorrow settling deep into my bones. The son I had sacrificed everything for had chosen the path of least resistance, leaving his mother to bear the brunt of their cruelty. I felt completely invisible, erased from my own life. But underneath that crushing sorrow, a quiet, cold clarity began to take root. It was a Tuesday evening when the blinders finally fell from my eyes. I had spent the entire afternoon washing and folding their laundry. My joints were aching with that familiar, dull throb that comes from 40 years of walking on hard hospital floors. I carried a heavy woven basket filled with Brittany's expensive silk blouses and Brad's designer shirts up the stairs. I was panting slightly by the time I reached the landing. The hallway was dark, but a thin slice of light spilled out from the master bedroom door, which had been left just slightly ajar. I raised my hand to push the door open and announce myself. But the sound of Brad's frantic voice stopped me dead in my tracks. His voice was usually loud and arrogant, but right then it was a tight, desperate whisper. He was pacing the floor. I could hear his heavy boots scuffing the hard wood I had polished with my own 2 hands. He told Brittany that his startup company was completely underwater. He said his investors were threatening to pull out by the end of the month, and if he did not get a massive injection of cash immediately, he was going to face total bankruptcy. He was begging her for a bailout. Then I heard Brittany speak. Her voice was not the sweet, high-pitched tone she used when my son was in the room. It was cold, sharp, and dripping with calculation. She told her brother to calm down and trust her. She said she had been working on a solution since the day she moved in. She promised him the money was practically already in their bank account. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding that heavy laundry basket against my chest, scarcely daring to breathe, as I listened to the woman who slept next to my son outline the complete destruction of my life. Brittany told Brad that my house was worth over $600,000 and was completely paid off. She called it a gold mine just sitting there going to waste on a clueless old woman. She explained her master plan with chilling precision. She said Andre was already feeling the pressure of their financial struggles. She planned to convince him that keeping the house in my name was a massive financial liability. She was going to tell Andre that the government would seize my assets to pay for future medical bills using the guise of estate tax planning to scare him. She said Andre was so naive and so eager to please her that he would believe anything she framed as financial protection for the family. Her plan was to have Andre convince me to sign a quitclaim deed. They would tell me it was just a standard legal maneuver to transfer the property into a family trust to keep it safe. But in reality, that document would transfer sole ownership of my life's work directly into their hands. Once my name was off the deed, Brittany told her brother they would immediately take out a massive home equity loan. They would drain every single ounce of value out of the property to fund Brad's failing business. Brad let out a nervous laugh and asked her what they were going to do with me once they took the money. He said I would obviously notice when the bank paperwork started arriving. Brittany did not even hesitate. Her response was so cruel, so utterly devoid of human empathy, that my blood turned to ice water in my veins. She said I would not be around to see any bank statements. She told Brad that as soon as the ink was dry on that quitclaim deed, she was going to have me declared unfit to live independently. She bragged about how she had already been laying the groundwork, constantly telling Andre that I was becoming forgetful, that I was a hazard in the kitchen, and that I was showing signs of early dementia. She said they would use the loan money for the business, and they would dump me in one of those cheap state-run assisted living facilities on the outskirts of the city. She actually laughed and said the state would cover my room and board, so it would not cost them a single dime. She called me a senile burden and said it was time for me to get out of the way so they could finally live the life they deserved. I stood in the shadows of my own hallway, listening to the sheer evil radiating from my bedroom. My hands gripped the edges of the laundry basket so tightly my knuckles turned white. A weaker woman might have collapsed right there on the floor. A different mother might have burst into that room, screaming and crying, demanding answers, or calling for her son. But 40 years in a pediatric ward teaches you how to handle a crisis. It teaches you how to compartmentalize your panic when the monitors start flatlining. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing heartbreak I had been carrying for weeks vanished in an instant, replaced by a profound clinical clarity. They thought I was just a tired old nurse who could be easily discarded. They thought my love for my son made me stupid. I slowly backed away from the door, quietly carrying the laundry basket back down the stairs. I placed it on the kitchen table and looked around my beautiful home. They wanted a war over my legacy. They had no idea they had just awakened a woman who knew exactly how to fight. I walked down the hallway to my small room on the first floor and closed the door without making a single sound. The silence of that room wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the tears fall. I did not cry because I was afraid of losing my house. I cried because I realized I had already lost my son, the boy I had sacrificed my youth for. The boy I had worked double shifts to put through college was standing by while his wife and her brother planned to strip me of my dignity and lock me away in a state-run facility. I mourned the Andre I had raised. I wept for the mother and son bond that Brittany had so easily severed. But my tears did not last long. 40 years of working in a pediatric ward taught me that panicking does not save lives. When the monitors start flashing red, you do not break down. You assess the situation and you take action. I wiped my face and looked at my reflection in the mirror above my dresser. The woman looking back at me was not a helpless victim. She was a survivor. My sadness hardened into something cold and sharp. I had spent my entire life protecting my son from the world, but now I had to protect myself from him and the woman he chose to marry. They thought I was just a tired old nurse who would quietly sign over her life work. They completely underestimated the strength of a black mother who built her empire from scratch. I was not going to yell, and I was not going to argue. Arguments were for people who wanted to compromise. I wanted absolute justice. I stayed up the rest of the night gathering my property deeds, my bank statements, and every piece of financial documentation I had kept securely locked in my safe. The very next morning, long before Brittany or Brad even thought about rolling out of bed, I dressed in my sharpest navy suit and drove downtown to see my longtime lawyer and financial advisor, Mr. Hayes. I had known Mr. Hayes for over 20 years. He was a brilliant, no-nonsense professional who had helped me set up Andre College funds back in the day. When I sat down in his leather chair and explained exactly what I had overheard in my hallway the night before, his face turned rigid with disbelief. I laid my documents out on his polished mahogany desk and told him I needed a plan that was bulletproof. I told him I wanted to use their own greed against them in a way that was entirely legal and absolutely devastating. Mr. Hayes listened intently, taking notes as I explained Brittany's scheme to have me sign a quitclaim deed. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He told me that if they wanted the deed to my house so badly, we were going to give it to them. But we were going to give it to them entirely on my terms. For the next 3 hours, Mr. Hayes and I meticulously crafted a financial trap so deep and so flawless that Brittany and Brad would never see the bottom of it until it was too late. We reviewed the equity of my home, the local real estate laws, and the exact legal mechanisms required for transferring property titles. Mr. Hayes assured me that because of their sheer arrogance and their rush to get their hands on my asset, they would be utterly blind to the fine print. I signed the necessary preliminary paperwork right there in his office, securing my own future, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for their financial ruin. I walked out of that office feeling like a brand new woman. I was no longer a victim waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was a strategist, holding all the right cards. When I returned home that afternoon, my performance began. If Brittany wanted to paint the narrative that I was a confused, senile old woman who needed them to manage her life, then I was going to give her a show worthy of an award. I started acting absent-minded. I would leave my keys in the refrigerator or forget where I placed my reading glasses, forcing Brittany to find them for me. Whenever Brad barked an order at me from the sofa, I would just nod meekly and bring him his coffee without a single word of protest. I made myself smaller. I stopped cooking my traditional meals and let Brittany fill the kitchen with her tasteless diet food. I completely stopped arguing about the disrespect or the messes left in the living room. I became docile, agreeable, and perfectly submissive. It worked exactly as Mr. Hayes and I had anticipated. Brittany ate it up. She thrived on the false sense of superiority. I would catch her smirking at Brad, giving him knowing looks that silently screamed how easy this was going to be. She truly believed her psychological manipulation had broken my spirit. She thought she was watching the rapid decline of a tired woman who was finally ready to hand over the reins. Andre noticed the change too, but instead of showing concern for his mother, he just looked relieved that I was no longer putting up a fight. It made his life easier to believe the lie. They all thought they had successfully subdued me. They thought my compliance was a sign of weakness. But my silence was not surrender. It was the quiet before a catastrophic storm. I watched them gloat in my house, entirely unaware that the trap had already been set and the jaws were just waiting to snap shut. I sat across from Mr. Hayes in his leather chairs the very next day. The bright Georgia sun was pouring through the heavy blinds of his downtown office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. I looked at this brilliant man who had guided my finances for over 20 years and told him exactly what I needed to do. I told him I wanted to leave my son and his wife the house. I told him I wanted to give them exactly what they were scheming to steal from me, but I wanted to make sure it absolutely destroyed them. Mr. Hayes leaned back, steepled his fingers, and smiled a slow, deliberate smile that let me know he completely understood the assignment. We got straight to work. My house, the beautiful 4-bedroom home I had scrubbed, polished, and paid for with 40 years of grueling nursing shifts, was worth a solid $600,000. It was completely paid off. There was not a single cent of debt attached to that property. To Brittany and her entitled brother Brad, it was a giant piggy bank just waiting to be cracked open to save his failing startup business. But Mr. Hayes and I decided to crack it open first. Over the next few weeks, operating in absolute secrecy while my family thought I was going to harmless doctor appointments or grocery shopping. I executed the most brilliant financial maneuver of my life. I took out a massive reverse mortgage and a maximum capacity home equity loan against my own property, because my credit was absolutely flawless and the house was free and clear. The bank practically threw the money at me. I legally extracted 100% of the equity. I pulled every single penny of that $600,000 right out from under the roof, but we definitely did not stop there. Keeping that kind of cash in a standard local bank account would have been a rookie mistake. Brittany was incredibly sneaky, and I knew she would eventually try to snoop through my mail or hack into my online banking. So Mr. Hayes guided me in establishing an ironclad, irrevocable offshore trust. It was a financial fortress. I transferred every single dollar of that loan money directly into that trust. Once the funds crossed international borders and settled into that specific account, they were legally untouchable. No domestic court, no greedy daughter-in-law, and certainly no arrogant brother-in-law could ever access a dime of it. It belonged entirely to me, secured for the rest of my natural life, to ensure I would never have to worry about a thing. To the naked eye, nothing about the property had changed. The solid oak floors still shined beautifully. The deep red rose bushes still bloomed perfectly in the front yard, and the walls stood just as tall and proud as they always had. But financially, that house was now completely underwater. It was an empty, hollow shell, heavily burdened by a massive default-ready debt. The mortgage payments I set up were astronomical, designed to balloon incredibly fast. I had essentially turned my beautiful suburban American dream home into a toxic financial ticking time bomb. And the absolute best part was that Brittany and Brad were far too arrogant to even imagine that a retired pediatric nurse was capable of such a sophisticated, ruthless maneuver. They thought they were the smartest people in the entire room. They truly thought I was just passing my days knitting and forgetting where I put my reading glasses. While they were busy picking out modern paint colors for my living room and pricing out the luxury cars they planned to buy with my hard-earned equity, I was quietly securing the bag. Every time Brittany smiled at me with that fake, condescending sweetness, I just smiled right back, knowing her entire future was built on a foundation of quicksand. I went to bed every night sleeping like a baby in my small downstairs guest room, knowing my actual wealth was safely tucked away, where she could never reach it. The trap was set completely invisible and perfectly legal. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. The final push came exactly 1 week later. I was sitting in my armchair in the living room pretending to struggle with a crossword puzzle when Brittany and Andre walked in. They stood side by side looking like two people about to deliver rehearsed bad news. Brad was lurking near the kitchen trying to look casual, but his eyes were darting around with pure, unrestrained greed. Andre looked physically sick. He was sweating slightly, and he absolutely refused to make eye contact with me. He just stared at his expensive shoes. Brittany, however, was in her element. She stepped forward with a fake, deeply concerned expression plastered across her face. She sat down softly on the edge of the sofa and reached out to touch my knee. She told me we needed to have a very serious family discussion. She coldly stated that they had been watching me closely and they were incredibly worried. She lied right to my face, saying I had left the gas stove running twice that week and that I was becoming a genuine hazard to myself. She said it broke her heart, but they needed to step in and manage my care for my own safety. Then Andre finally spoke. His voice was trembling, entirely stripped of the confidence I had raised him to have. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from a folder he was holding behind his back. He told me it was a quitclaim deed and an estate tax planning agreement. He mumbled that keeping the house in my name was a massive financial risk and that transferring the deed to them would protect the asset and allow them to take care of me properly. He said I just needed to sign the papers and they would handle all the stressful responsibilities from now on. I looked at the documents. Mr. Hayes had been incredibly thorough when we prepared for this moment. Included in that stack of papers, brilliantly disguised beneath layers of dense legal jargon, was an assumption of debt agreement. By signing those specific papers to take ownership of the house, Brittany and Brad would be legally assuming full responsibility for the massive loans I had just taken out. They were so blinded by their own ambition and so eager to steal my $600,000 house that they completely blinded themselves to the fine print. They were so arrogant they did not even bother to do a proper title search. They just assumed the clueless old nurse was handing them a free and clear gold mine. I knew this was my moment. I let my hands shake visibly. I forced a few stray tears to well up in my eyes, letting them spill slowly down my cheeks. I slumped my shoulders, physically embodying the defeated, broken woman they so desperately wanted me to be. I whispered that I just wanted to be safe, and that I trusted my son to do what was best for his mother. I took the pen Andre offered me, and with a feigned, shaky hand, I signed every single page right where they told me to. The second my pen lifted from the final signature line, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The fake concern vanished from Brittany's face, instantly replaced by a triumphant, predatory smirk. Brad actually clapped his hands together from the kitchen, unable to contain his excitement. Andre just quickly gathered the papers, still looking down, unable to face the mother he had just betrayed. I stood up slowly, keeping my head bowed. I told them I was feeling very tired and just wanted to go rest. I walked down the hallway to my small room, but once the door clicked shut, the tears immediately stopped. My posture straightened. I pulled my 2 large suitcases from under the bed, the ones I had already packed days ago with all my essentials, my important documents, and my favorite clothes. I took one last look around the tiny room that had been my prison, grabbed my heavy brass house keys, and zipped my bags. I pulled out my phone and ordered an Uber, selecting the most luxurious ride available. When I walked back out into the hallway, rolling my luggage, I could hear the sound of a champagne cork popping in the kitchen. Brittany was laughing, loudly, clinking glasses with her brother, celebrating their massive victory. I stood in the doorway, smiled, handed her those keys, and walked right out my front door. She thought she had just secured a fortune. She had no idea she had just signed her life away, exactly 3 days after I walked out of my front door and handed over those heavy brass keys. I was sitting on the private balcony of a gorgeous luxury condominium right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I leased it using the cash I legally pulled from my offshore trust. I was sipping a cup of chamomile tea, watching the morning sun reflect off the glass skyscrapers surrounding me. There were no dirty boots scuffing my floors. There was no one complaining about the smell of my cooking. There was only the sweet, uninterrupted sound of my own peace. My phone had been buzzing constantly since 8 this morning. I watched the screen light up repeatedly with the name Brittany. I let it ring. Taking a breath of crisp air, finishing my herbal tea, and enjoying the profound, unbroken quiet that now belonged entirely to me. By the 15th call, I decided it was time to face the music. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear without saying a single word. I did not need to speak. The sound coming through the speaker was absolute, unfiltered chaos. Brittany was screaming and sobbing so hysterically I could barely understand her. Between her frantic gasps, the picture of their nightmare began to emerge. The bank had sent the official foreclosure notice by certified mail. That morning, Brittany cried that the documents stated the house was over $500 million in default. She shrieked that it had to be a mistake, that the house was supposed to be fully paid off, and that the bank was threatening to take everything they owned. I simply listened to her panic, escalating with every single word she spoke. feeling the cool breeze gently wash over my face as her entire world completely crumbled. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I spoke with a calm, even tone that contrasted sharply with her hysteria. I told her there was no mistake. I explained to her using slow and deliberate words exactly what she and her arrogant brother had signed. I reminded her of the assumption of debt agreement tucked neatly inside the quitclaim deed she had been so desperate to get her hands on because she and Brad had been so blinded by their greed they never bothered to do a proper title search. By signing those papers to take ownership of my home, they had legally and completely assumed full liability for the massive reverse mortgage and equity loans. I had taken out days prior. I told her the money was permanently gone, safely secured in an irrevocable offshore trust that no domestic bank or greedy relative could ever touch, leaving them holding an empty, financially underwater shell of a house. The silence on the other end of the line was profound as the reality of my words sank in. Then the screaming started again. She sobbed that the business accounts of Brad had been completely frozen by the bank and that his investors were pulling out because of the massive liability now attached to his name. She cried that they were facing total unrecoverable bankruptcy. She begged me to fix it, the Chipanso, same woman who had thrown away my family heirlooms, the woman who had pinched her nose at the food of my ancestors, the woman who had coldly plotted to lock me away in a state-run facility so she could steal my life. Work was now begging me for mercy. She cried that we were families, that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood, that I had to call the bank and undo the transfer. I let her cry for another moment before I delivered my final response. Family, I repeated, letting the word hang heavily in the air. I asked her if family throws a lifetime of memories into a rented dumpster. I asked her if family treats a 68-year-old woman like hired help in her own home. I asked her if family plots to declare a perfectly healthy woman mentally unfit just to steal her legacy and dump her in a cheap nursing home. She gasped, realizing in that exact moment that I had heard every single word of her sinister plan. I told her that I had spent 4 decades emptying myself out to build a foundation for my family. But I only help people who respect me. I told her she wanted the house, and now she had it. Along with every single consequence attached to it, I advised her to start packing her bags because the bank would not be nearly as accommodating as I had been. Without waiting for her response, I pulled the phone away from my ear, ended the call and permanently blocked her number. And his number too. The silence returned to my balcony sweeter and more satisfying than ever before. The aftermath of their sheer arrogance unfolded exactly as Mr. Hayes and I had predicted. The failing startup business of Brad collapsed entirely within a matter of weeks. The massive default-ready debt they had blindly assumed instantly destroyed his financial standing, causing his remaining investors to flee the moment his business accounts were frozen. Brittany, who had always cared so deeply about designer labels' status and portraying an image of wealth, watched her own credit score plummet into total ruin. They could not afford the astronomical balloon payments attached to the house, nor could they secure a loan to cover them. The bank moved forward with the foreclosure proceedings aggressively. Within a few short months, Brittany, Brad, and Andre were formally evicted from the very house they had plotted to steal. They were escorted off the property with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of a $500,000 debt permanently attached to their names. Andre tried to reach out to me during this fallout. He showed up at the lobby of my luxury condominium building looking pale, exhausted, and thoroughly defeated. The concierge called up to my suite, asking if I wanted to receive a visitor. I watched him on the security feed. My son. The boy. I had sacrificed my youth for the boy. I had worked countless double shifts to put through college debt-free, was standing there with his head bowed, I knew he had finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He had traded a mother who loved him unconditionally for a superficial woman who had completely ruined him. He wanted to apologize. He wanted me to rescue him one more time, just like I had always done. But the job of a mother is to prepare her child for the real world. The real world demands accountability. I told the concierge to send him away immediately, and I firmly requested that he not be permitted inside the building again. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but protecting my peace was my ultimate priority. He had made his choice when he stood in silence and let his wife trample all over my dignity. Now he had to live with the consequences of that silence. I refused to let him back into my life under any circumstances. Releasing myself from the burden of my ungrateful family was the most profoundly liberating experience of my entire existence. I finally began to breathe in the fresh, vibrant air of my new life. The wealth safely secured in my offshore trust gave me an unprecedented level of security and freedom. I spent my days exploring the city, joining a community gardening club, where my knowledge of roses was deeply appreciated, and building a circle of strong, vibrant friends who respected and valued my company. I hired a personal trainer to help ease the aches in my joints from my nursing days, and I started cooking my traditional southern meals again, hosting lavish dinner parties for my new friends, who savored every single bite. Sitting on my balcony today, feeling the warm evening breeze, I look back at the 68 years of my life with absolute clarity. I spent 4 decades giving everything I had to build a dream that I thought belonged to my son. I polished floors, planted gardens, and emptied my own cup so he could be full. But true love, true family cannot be bought or forced. If someone is capable of looking at your sacrifices and seeing nothing but an opportunity for exploitation, they do not deserve a place in your future. Tomorrow morning I am boarding a luxury flight to Europe to embark on a month-long Mediterranean cruise. I am going to drink incredibly expensive wine, watch the beautiful sunset over the sparkling ocean, and finally fully enjoy the sweet fruits of my 40 years of relentless labor. I am no longer just a retired nurse or a discarded mother. I am a wealthy, empowered, and entirely free woman, and I have never been happier. Looking out over the skyline of this beautiful city, I find myself thinking about what it truly means to be a mother and what it means to be a family. For so long, I believed that because I gave birth to my son, because I held him when he was sick and sacrificed my own youth to pave his way, I owed him a lifetime of endless grace. Society tells us that the love of a mother must remain completely unconditional, that we must endure any amount of disrespect simply because it comes from our own flesh and blood. But let me tell you the hardest truth I have ever had to learn. Giving birth to a child does not mean you owe them your dignity. You do not lose your right to be treated like a human being just because you hold the title of mother. True love, the kind of love that sustains a family through the generations, absolutely requires respect. If someone looks at your lifelong sacrifices and only sees an opportunity to exploit you, then they have broken that sacred bond, not you. I had to learn that protecting myself did not make me a bad mother. It made me a woman who finally realized her own worth. You can love your children with every single beat of your heart, but you must always love yourself enough to draw a line in the sand when they try to cross it. My journey from a heartbroken woman sitting in a downstairs guest room to a free and empowered woman was not easy. It took courage, planning, and a firm refusal to be a victim in my own story. I hope my journey shows you that it is never too late to take back your power. You can rewrite the ending of your own story at any age. You deserve to live out your golden years in absolute peace and comfort, surrounded by people who cherish you for exactly who you are. Do not ever settle for less. If you learned something from my story today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I want to know I am not alone out here. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching, from what time it is in your city, and exactly what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have walked away like I did? Or would you have handled the situation differently? Share your thoughts with me, because reading your words gives me so much joy and strength. We are a community of survivors, of strong people who know our worth, and I am so incredibly grateful to have shared my truth with you today. Thank you for listening to my journey and for standing by me through every single twist and turn of this incredibly difficult and deeply personal experience. Stay blessed, stay sharp, and please remember to never let anyone, not even your own family, steal your crown.